Welcome to the Hidden Library. Tonight, we unseal a volume long kept from the light, where a lonely farm at the edge of the marsh, a death dismissed as misadventure, and a decade-old injustice quietly converge. Before we begin, if you value stories recovered from silence, like and subscribe to support the Hidden Library, and share in the comments where you're listening from as this chapter is opened. Now, turn the page carefully and step into the secret at Heatherbank Farm. Chapter 1. An Unwelcome Return. The letter had arrived on a Tuesday, written in Dolly Bantry's familiar, sprawling hand, and Miss Marple had accepted the invitation without hesitation. A fortnight at Gossington Hall in early October, when the gardens still held their colour and the village prepared for harvest festival, seemed entirely agreeable. She had not expected, however, to find her old friend in such a state of restless energy. "Jane, you must tell me what you think," Mrs. Bantry announced the moment Miss Marple settled into the drawing-room that first afternoon. Tea stood ready on the table, but Dolly made no move to pour. "The whole village talks of nothing else, and I confess I cannot make head nor tail of it." Miss Marple reached for her knitting bag, extracting the grey wool she had been working on for the past month. "How very intriguing, Dolly. What particular matter has captured everyone's attention?" "Arthur Coleman's death." Mrs. Bantry perched on the edge of her chair, hands clasped in her lap. 3 weeks ago now, they found him in the milking shed at Heatherbank Farm, that lonely place beyond the marsh, you know it, with a pitchfork beside him. Dr. Haydick declared it an accident straight away, and Inspector Slack closed the matter within 2 days. How dreadful. Miss Marple's needles began their steady rhythm. A farming accident, then. That's what they say. Mrs. Bantry leaned forward. "But here's the peculiar thing, Jane. Arthur Coleman was terrified of that shed. Everyone knew it. He'd had a bad fall there years ago, cracked 3 ribs, and afterwards he refused to enter it after dark. Kept all the equipment elsewhere, had the evening milking done by 4 o'clock at the latest. Yet they found him there at dawn, stone dead, and the lantern burning beside him." The needles paused for the briefest moment, then resumed. "How very strange," Miss Marple murmured. "Was there no explanation for why he might have gone there?" Mrs. Bantry threw up her hands. "None that satisfies anyone with sense. His wife claims she heard nothing, slept soundly through the entire night. The brother, George Coleman, recently back from South Africa, says Arthur sometimes checked on sick animals in the evening, but there were no sick animals. And then there's the farmhand, Nell Harper, a capable girl who's been with them 2 years. She sleeps in the cottage across the yard and insists she saw nothing unusual. The brother returned from South Africa." Miss Marple tilted her head. "After how long?" 20 years, near enough." Mrs. Bantry finally reached for the teapot. "Arthur inherited Heatherbank when their father died. George was the younger son and got nothing. He went abroad in rather a temper, made something of himself in mining, or so they say. Then Arthur wrote to him 6 months ago, asking him to come back and help with the farm. Quite out of the blue, apparently." "How interesting." Miss Marple accepted her cup. "And did George come willingly?" "Nobody knows. He arrived in May, moved into the spare room, and has been perfectly civil on the surface." Mrs. Bantry lowered her voice, though they were quite alone. "But Mrs. Grant, she helps with the eggs and butter, says the 2 brothers barely spoke to each other except when necessary. George made it clear he thought Arthur a fool for never modernizing the farm, and Arthur treated George like an unwelcome guest in his own house." The front door opened and closed. Dr. Haydick's cheerful voice carried down the hall. "Ah, there you are, Dolly. I saw Miss Marple's arrival and thought I'd—" He stopped in the doorway, his weathered face breaking into a genuine smile. "Miss Marple, what a delightful surprise. Staying long?" "A fortnight, Doctor. How kind of you to call." He settled into his usual chair, accepting tea from Mrs. Bantry with practiced ease. The conversation drifted through village news. A new curate at the vicarage, plans for the harvest festival, Mrs. Price's youngest daughter's engagement, until Mrs. Bantry, unable to contain herself, returned to the subject occupying her thoughts. "Doctor, you must explain to Jane about Arthur Coleman. She finds it as peculiar as I do." Dr. Haydock's expression shifted, becoming carefully neutral. "There's nothing to explain, Dolly. Tragic accident, nothing more." "But you examined the body." Mrs. Bantry refused to be deterred. "What exactly happened?" The doctor set down his cup with deliberate precision. "Arthur Coleman died from a puncture wound to the chest caused by falling against a pitchfork. The implement was lying beside him, knocked over in the fall. Death would have been nearly instantaneous." "Nearly?" Miss Marple's needles continued their steady work, her eyes fixed on the pattern forming in the grey wool. "Well, there was a head injury as well. He'd struck his head on something, possibly the stone trough in the corner, but the chest wound was the fatal injury, no question." "And the time of death?" Dr. Haydock shifted in his chair. "Sometime between midnight and 2 o'clock in the morning, based on body temperature and rigor mortis." "How very precise." Miss Marple looked up, her blue eyes bright with interest. "And was there anything else unusual about the scene? Forgive my curiosity, Doctor, but at my age one develops a certain fascination with these matters." The doctor studied her for a moment, then gave a slight shrug. "The only odd thing, if you must know, was Arthur's boots. They were quite clean, remarkably so, considering he'd presumably walked through the muddy yard to reach the shed. But boots sometimes stay clean if one steps carefully, particularly if the ground has dried in patches." "Of course," Miss Marple agreed. "Though mud does have a way of clinging, doesn't it? Particularly in October, with the recent rains." An uncomfortable silence settled over the room. Dr. Haydock cleared his throat and rose to his feet. "Well, I must be going. Patients to see before evening surgery." He paused at the door, looking back at Miss Marple with an expression she could not quite read. "It was an accident, Miss Marple. These things happen on farms. Best not to go looking for complications where none exist." After he left, Mrs. Bantry turned to her friend with barely suppressed excitement. "You see, even Dr. Haydock thinks there's something wrong, though he won't say so." Miss Marple set down her knitting, folding her hands in her lap. Her gaze drifted to the window, where the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the lawn. "It reminds me," she said softly, "of something that happened many years ago in St. Mary Mead. A grocer's assistant named Briggs, a young man everyone trusted. One morning they found the till empty and Briggs vanished. Everyone assumed he'd stolen the money and run off, but I always wondered why he'd left his coat behind. It was December, bitterly cold, and Briggs had a weak chest. He wouldn't have gone far without that coat." "What happened?" Mrs. Bantry asked. Miss Marple picked up her knitting once more. "They found him 3 days later in the cellar, quite dead. He'd gone down to check a gas leak the grocer had mentioned, been overcome by fumes, and fallen. The money was discovered later. The grocer's nephew had taken it and attempted to cast blame on poor Briggs." "How terrible." "Yes." The needles resumed their rhythmic clicking. People always assume the obvious answer, you see. But sometimes the obvious answer is precisely what someone wants them to think. Outside, the light faded toward dusk, and somewhere in the distance, beyond the comfortable walls of Gossington Hall, Heatherbank Farm stood silent against the darkening sky. Chapter 2. The Inhabitants of Heatherbank. Mrs. Bantry's motor car rattled along the narrow lane toward Heatherbank Farm the following afternoon. Miss Marple sat beside her, knitting bag balanced on her lap, watching the hedgerows give way to open fields. "You're quite certain Mrs. Coleman won't mind the intrusion?" Miss Marple asked. "Not at all. I telephoned this morning. One must observe the proprieties even in the country." Mrs. Bantry navigated a sharp bend with more enthusiasm than skill. Poor Edith will be glad of the company, I should think. She's terribly isolated out here. The farm appeared around the final curve like something from a watercolor, though the reality proved less charming than the distance suggested. The house itself stood square and grey, its windows small and deep-set, the kind of dwelling built to withstand weather rather than please the eye. Beyond it stretched the outbuildings, barn, stable, and the infamous milking shed, separated from the rest by a stretch of muddy yard. A woman emerged from the front door as they approached, wiping her hands on her apron. She was perhaps 45, thin in the way of wire rather than fragility, with movements that suggested constant nervous energy. "Mrs. Bantry, how kind of you to visit." Her voice carried the flat vowels of someone born to the land. "And you've brought a friend." "This is Miss Marple, from St. Mary Mead. She's staying with me at Gossington for a fortnight." Mrs. Coleman's smile flickered like a candle in a draught. "You're very welcome. Please, come inside. I've just made tea." The drawing room held the faded gentility of better times. Good furniture, grown shabby, curtains that had once been expensive but now hung limp with age. Mrs. Coleman poured tea with hands that trembled slightly, the cup rattling against the saucer as she passed it to Miss Marple. "You have my deepest sympathies," Miss Marple said. "Mrs. Bantry told me of your loss." "Thank you." Mrs. Coleman's gaze drifted to the window, toward the fields beyond. "It was very sudden? One doesn't expect. That is, Arthur was always so careful about the farm. He knew every danger." "Had he been unwell?" Miss Marple asked. The question seemed to catch Mrs. Coleman off guard. Her fingers tightened around her cup. Not unwell exactly. Tired, perhaps. He hadn't been sleeping properly for some weeks. Worried about the accounts, the price of feed, the usual troubles. She set down her cup with excessive care. But then, farming is always a worry, isn't it? Footsteps sounded in the hall, heavy and deliberate. A man appeared in the doorway, sharp-featured, with the sun-weathered skin of someone who had spent years in a hotter climate. His eyes assessed the visitors with undisguised calculation. "George, these are Mrs. Bantry and Miss Marple, from the village." Mrs. Coleman's voice carried a note of pleading. "They've come to pay their respects." George Coleman inclined his head, but made no move to enter the room. "Good of you, though I'm afraid we're rather occupied with settling Arthur's affairs." "Of course." Mrs. Bantry smiled with determined cheerfulness. "We won't intrude long. Such a shock for you, coming all the way from South Africa only to face this tragedy." A shock indeed. Something bitter twisted in George Coleman's expression, though perhaps less of one than you might think. Arthur had a talent for creating his own disasters. "George, please." Mrs. Coleman half rose from her chair. "Why pretend otherwise, Edith? He ran this place into near ruin with his stubbornness." George turned to the visitors. "My brother refused every modern improvement, insisted on methods our grandfather would have found outdated. It's a wonder the farm survived at all." "You must have been disappointed to find it in such a state," Miss Marple observed. George's eyes narrowed. "I was summoned back to save it, Miss Marple." Arthur finally admitted he needed help, though the admission nearly choked him. 6 months I've been here, trying to repair years of neglect." A knock at the door interrupted the tension. A young woman entered, carrying a jug of fresh milk. She was perhaps 25, with dark hair pulled back severely and hands that bore the marks of hard work. Her posture suggested capability, the kind of person who could manage any task set before her. "Nell, how thoughtful." Mrs. Coleman's relief was palpable. "Ladies, this is Nell Harper, our farm hand. She's been absolutely invaluable these past 2 years." Nell set down the jug, her movements efficient. "I thought you might need it for tea, ma'am. Good afternoon." Her voice held no trace of the local accent. Miss Marple noted this with interest. "You're not from this part of the country, Miss Harper?" she asked. Nell's gaze met hers directly. "Devon, originally." I came to Heatherbank 2 years ago when Mr. Coleman advertised for help. And stayed despite everything, George muttered. Extraordinary loyalty, really, given Arthur's temperament. Mr. Coleman was always fair with me. Nell's tone remained neutral, but her hands clenched briefly at her sides. I'm sorry for your loss, Mrs. Coleman. If you need anything else, I'll be in the dairy. She left quickly, her footsteps fading toward the back of the house. A treasure, that girl, Mrs. Coleman said. I don't know what I'd do without her. She manages the dairy entirely on her own, and the sheep as well. Even Arthur admitted she had a gift for the work. High praise indeed if your husband was difficult to please. Mrs. Bantry accepted another cup of tea. Did he have many disagreements with the neighbors as well? One hears such stories about boundary disputes in farming country. Mrs. Coleman's cup rattled again. Arthur kept to himself mostly, though there was some unpleasantness with Mr. Shaw over the water rights to the stream. But that's all settled now. Settled because Arthur's dead, George said flatly. Shaw gets his way by default. Convenient for him. You cannot possibly suggest... Mrs. Coleman's voice rose, then broke. She pressed a hand to her mouth. Miss Marple set down her knitting, her expression gentle. Mrs. Bantry and I should take our leave. We've tired you, Mrs. Coleman, and that was thoughtless of us. No, please, I'm perfectly... But Mrs. Coleman's protest lacked conviction. She looked exhausted, like someone who hadn't slept properly in weeks. They made their farewells. As Mrs. Bantry's motor car turned back toward the lane, Miss Marple glanced toward the fields. Nell Harper stood near the stream in the distance, her figure small against the grey sky. She remained motionless, staring at the water as though it held answers she desperately sought. Well, Mrs. Bantry demanded once they reached the main road. What do you make of them all? Miss Marple resumed her knitting, the needles clicking softly. Mrs. Coleman is frightened of something. George Coleman is angry, though whether at his brother's death or his brother's life remains unclear. And Miss Harper, yes, Miss Harper knows more than she admits. Did you notice how she avoided looking at the marsh when we arrived? She took the long way round from the dairy, though the direct path would have been half the distance. Mrs. Bantry frowned. Perhaps she simply dislikes marshy ground. Many people do. Perhaps. Miss Marple's needles paused. Though I should very much like to know why Mrs. Coleman flinched when you mentioned the stream. Did she? I didn't notice. Twice, Miss Marple said quietly. Once when George spoke of water rights, and again when Nell walked toward the fields. Both times her whole body tensed as though anticipating pain. The motor car rumbled on through the gathering dusk. Behind them, Heatherbank Farm settled into evening silence, its secrets held close like a miser guard's gold. At the post office window, Mrs. Grant watched their departure with sharp eyes, already composing the story she would tell over tomorrow's tea. Chapter 3. Whispers from the Past. Inspector Slack arrived at Gossington Hall the following morning with the resigned expression of a man fulfilling an unavoidable obligation. Mrs. Bantry had telephoned him regarding a broken lock on the garden shed, a transparent excuse, as both of them knew, but propriety demanded he investigate. Miss Marple encountered him in the morning room, where she sat with her knitting beside the window that overlooked the rose garden. Inspector Slack, what a pleasant surprise. The inspector's moustache twitched. Miss Marple, I might have known Mrs. Bantry would have company. Do sit down. You look quite worn out. Miss Marple gestured to the chair opposite. Mrs. Bantry will return shortly with tea. She's speaking with the gardener about the lock, though I suspect it's simply rusted shut rather than broken. Slack lowered himself into the chair with the wariness of a man entering enemy territory. I don't suppose this visit has anything to do with Arthur Coleman's accident? What an odd question, Inspector. Why should it? Because Mrs. Bantry has been asking questions all over the village, and wherever Mrs. Bantry asks questions, you're generally at the root of it. He fixed her with a stern look. The case is closed, Miss Marple. Tragic accident, nothing more. Miss Marple's needles continued their steady rhythm. Of course, Inspector. Though I confess to some curiosity about the details. One hears such conflicting accounts in the village. There's nothing to hear. Man went into his shed at night, had some kind of accident, fell against a pitchfork. End of story. The lantern troubles me slightly, Miss Marple said, as though speaking to herself. Mrs. Bantry mentioned it was found burning inside the shed, yet Mr. Coleman apparently kept it by the door under normal circumstances. Slack shifted in his seat. What of it? He took it inside with him. But if he feared the shed after dark, and everyone assures me he did, why would he have gone so far into it? One would think he'd stay near the entrance, wouldn't one? Perhaps he had to reach something at the back. Perhaps. The needles paused. And the tear in his jacket. Did that provide any insight? The inspector's eyes narrowed. Who told you about that? Oh, one hears things. Miss Marple resumed knitting. Village life, you know. People do talk. Was it a significant tear? Slack stood abruptly, then seemed to remember his manners and sat again. It was consistent with catching on farm equipment, nothing suspicious about it. How reassuring. And you're quite satisfied about the time of death? Between midnight and 2 o'clock, I believe Dr. Haydick said. He did, and I am. Slack's voice held a note of challenge. Is there some reason I shouldn't be? Miss Marple looked up, her blue eyes innocent. Not at all, Inspector. Though it does seem peculiar that no one heard anything. The farmhouse isn't so very far from the shed, is it? Stone walls, windows closed against the cold. Mrs. Coleman is a sound sleeper, the brother's bedroom faces the other direction, and the farmhand sleeps across the yard in a separate cottage. Slack recited the facts, like a lesson learned by rote. There was nothing to hear, except Mr. Shaw saw a light and heard voices. The inspector's face darkened. Where did you hear that? Mrs. Grant mentioned it. She delivers eggs to Mr. Shaw's farm, you know, and he told her about it when she visited yesterday morning. Miss Marple's expression remained mild. He saw a light in the shed around 1 o'clock. Rather concerning, I should think, given what happened. Slack muttered something under his breath that Miss Marple chose not to pursue. Shaw mentioned it in his statement. He assumed Coleman was dealing with a sick animal. Nothing unusual in that. But there were no sick animals. He didn't know that at the time, did he? The inspector rose again, this time with evident determination. Miss Marple, I've indulged your curiosity out of respect for your past observations. But there's nothing mysterious about Arthur Coleman's death. The man had an accident. These things happen on farms. Of course they do. Miss Marple set down her knitting, folding her hands in her lap. It reminds me of a case in St. Mary Mead some years ago. The fishmonger's brother. Such a tragedy. He drowned in the river during a fishing trip. Everyone accepted it as an accident until someone noticed the brother had taken out a substantial insurance policy just 3 weeks before. Are you suggesting? I'm not suggesting anything, Inspector. Merely observing that sometimes what appears simple proves rather more complicated upon examination. She picked up her knitting once more, though I'm certain you've considered every possibility. Slack opened his mouth, closed it, then turned toward the door. Good day, Miss Marple. Please tell Mrs. Bantry I'll send someone round about the lock. After his departure, Mrs. Bantry swept into the room with triumphant energy. Well, did he tell you anything useful? A great deal, though not intentionally. Miss Marple's needles resumed their pattern. He's defensive, which suggests doubt. The torn jacket troubled him, as did Mr. Shaw's testimony about hearing voices, and he confirmed several details I'd wondered about. But he still insists it was an accident. What else can he say? The evidence is ambiguous, the witnesses unhelpful, and without clear proof of foul play, the coroner's verdict stands. Miss Marple paused, considering. I think I should like to visit the post office this afternoon, Dolly. Would you mind driving me?" Mrs. Bantry recognized that tone. "What are you planning?" "Nothing at all. Simply a conversation with the postmistress about sending a parcel to my nephew. One must attend to correspondence, after all." The post office occupied the ground floor of a cottage near the village green. Miss Trimble, the postmistress, presided over her domain with the fierce attention of a general surveying troops. She greeted Miss Marple with the deference due to a friend of Mrs. Bantry's. "Good afternoon, Miss Marple. How may I help you?" "I need to send this parcel to London." Miss Marple placed a small package on the counter. "Your service is so much more reliable than in St. Mary Mead. We've had such trouble with our postmistress lately. A dear woman, but terribly forgetful." Miss Trimble swelled with pride. "I run a tight ship here, every letter accounted for, every parcel recorded properly." "I'm certain you do. Such responsibility must give you remarkable insight into village affairs." Miss Marple counted out coins for the postage. "You must know everyone's business, in the most discreet way, of course." "Well, one does notice things." Miss Trimble lowered her voice. "Take that girl at Heatherbank Farm, Nell Harper, regular as clockwork with her money orders, sending funds to Dorset every month. Been doing it for 2 years now. How commendable. Supporting family, no doubt. That's what I thought at first, but the address is a solicitor's office in Bridport, not a private residence. Odd way to send money to family, isn't it?" Miss Marple agreed that it was indeed odd. "And her references," Miss Trimble continued, warming to her subject. "From a farm in Devon they were. But when Mrs. Price's sister visited from Exeter last year, she mentioned there was no such farm in the village Miss Harper claimed. I asked Miss Harper about it once. Very casual, you understand. And she said the farm had closed and been sold. Couldn't verify it one way or another. How very mysterious. That's what I thought. Not that she isn't a hard worker. Everyone says so. But there's something guarded about her, if you know what I mean, like she's watching her words all the time." Miss Marple collected her receipt and departed with expressions of gratitude. Outside, Mrs. Bantry waited with barely contained impatience. "Well?" "Miss Harper has been sending money to a solicitor in Dorset for 2 years, Miss Marple said, "and her references appear to be fabricated." "Good heavens, do you think she's a criminal?" "I think," Miss Marple said slowly, "that she came to Heatherbank Farm with a specific purpose. Whether that purpose was criminal remains to be seen." That evening, Miss Marple took her customary walk through the village. The route led past Heatherbank Farm, though she maintained a respectful distance. The milking shed stood dark against the twilight, its door closed, its secrets locked within. In the fading light, she observed Nell Harper crossing the fields toward her cottage. The girl moved with purpose, her path carefully avoiding the marshy ground near the stream. Even from a distance, Miss Marple could see the tension in her shoulders, the deliberate precision of her steps. Like someone walking through a graveyard, she thought, afraid of disturbing the dead. Chapter 4. The Weight of Silence. Miss Marple chose her moment with care. The following afternoon found her walking the lane toward Heatherbank Farm, armed with a basket of cuttings from Mrs. Bantry's prize roses and an expression of gentle determination. Mrs. Coleman answered the door herself, surprise flickering across her worn features. "Miss Marple, I wasn't expecting, that is, how kind of you to call. I hope I'm not intruding. Mrs. Bantry mentioned you once had a celebrated rose garden, and I thought these cuttings might prove useful for replanting." Miss Marple offered the basket. "They root quite readily in autumn." Mrs. Coleman accepted the gift with trembling hands. "How thoughtful. The garden has rather gone to seed these past years. Arthur said there was no time for ornamental planting when practical matters demanded attention." She paused at the threshold, indecision written in every line of her face. "Would you care to see where they might be planted?" "I should be delighted." The garden behind the house told its own story of neglect and earlier glory. Overgrown hedges marked where careful borders had once flourished. A stone bench sat half-hidden beneath brambles, and the remains of a rose arbor leaned at a dangerous angle. "It was my mother-in-law's pride," Mrs. Coleman said. "She spent hours here every day. After she died, Arthur forbade me from wasting time on it. He said I had duties inside the house." Miss Marple bent to examine the soil near the arbor. How sad. Gardens need tending, like everything else worth keeping. "Yes," the word emerged like a sigh. Mrs. Coleman sank onto the stone bench, her composure cracking like old plaster. "Everything needs tending, but some things break no matter how carefully you watch them." Miss Marple straightened, regarding the other woman with quiet sympathy. "You've been under terrible strain, Mrs. Coleman. Anyone can see that." "Can they?" Mrs. Coleman's laugh held no humor. "I thought I'd been managing rather well. Keeping up appearances, attending to the household, pretending everything was perfectly normal. But it wasn't normal, was it? Not for some time." The question hung between them like smoke. Mrs. Coleman stared at her hands, now clenched in her lap. "Arthur hadn't slept properly for weeks before he died. He would wake in the night, gasping, drenched in perspiration. Sometimes he spoke names I didn't recognize. Sometimes he simply stared at the ceiling until dawn." Her voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "I asked him what troubled him. He told me to mind my own business. How distressing for you both. The last week was worse. He barely ate, snapped at everyone, even Nell, who never gave him cause for complaint, and he kept watching the post, waiting for letters that never came. Or perhaps they did come, and he burned them before I could see." Miss Marple settled beside her on the bench, her knitting bag resting in her lap. "Did something particular happen to precipitate this change in his behavior?" Mrs. Coleman's fingers twisted together. "A letter arrived 6 weeks ago. I saw Arthur read it at breakfast. His face went gray. He left the table without a word. Locked himself in his study for 3 hours. When he emerged, he looked 10 years older." She drew a shaking breath. "That evening, he told me he needed to settle something from long ago, that he'd made mistakes that were coming home to roost. In the days that followed, while he was out in the fields, I searched his study. I found the papers he'd hidden, records of his dealings, dates, names. Proof of everything. That's when I knew for certain what he'd done." "Did he explain what mistakes?" "No, and I was too frightened to ask." Mrs. Coleman turned to face Miss Marple, desperation stark in her eyes. "You think I'm a coward, don't you?" A proper wife would have demanded the truth. "A proper wife," Miss Marple said gently, "often knows when pressing for truth will only make matters worse. Sometimes silence is a form of protection." Tears spilled down Mrs. Coleman's cheeks. "I begged him not to go out that night, the night he died. He'd been pacing the house since dinner, checking the windows, jumping at every sound. Around midnight, he put on his coat and said he had to settle matters. I tried to stop him, but he pushed past me. I stood at the bedroom window and watched him walk toward the shed." She pressed a hand to her mouth. "That was the last time I saw him alive." "You didn't follow him?" "I was too frightened, too weak." The words emerged bitter with self-recrimination. "I went back to bed and pulled the covers over my head like a child hiding from monsters. And in the morning, Nell came running to say Arthur was dead." Miss Marple drew yarn from her bag, beginning a new row with steady hands. "Mrs. Coleman, I must ask you something, and I hope you'll forgive the indelicacy. Do you know of anything in your husband's past that might have caused him such fear? Any business dealings, perhaps, that were not entirely proper?" Mrs. Coleman's face shuttered closed. "I don't know what you mean." "I think you do. George mentioned that Arthur had been involved in livestock trading, buying and selling through irregular channels. Was there more to it than that?" Silence stretched between them. A crow called from the fields beyond. harsh and mocking. "There was talk," Mrs. Coleman said at last. "Years ago, before we were married, livestock went missing from neighboring farms. Arthur testified against a young lad who worked here, said he'd seen him stealing sheep, driving them toward the marsh at night. The boy ran away. They found his cap and jacket by the stream, but never the body. Everyone assumed he'd drowned trying to escape." "But you don't believe that?" Mrs. Coleman stood abruptly, wrapping her arms around herself. "I don't know what I believe. Arthur never spoke of it, but whenever someone mentioned the marsh, he would change the subject, and he refused to let anyone work near the stream after dark." She turned back to Miss Marple, her face haunted. "Does that make him guilty of something? Or simply aware of how dangerous the marsh could be?" "Perhaps both." Miss Marple rose, collecting her knitting bag. "Thank you for speaking with me, Mrs. Coleman. I know how difficult these memories must be. Will you tell Inspector Slack what I've said?" "That depends on whether it has any bearing on your husband's death." Miss Marple met her gaze with surprising steel. "But I will tell you this. Secrets kept in fear poison everything they touch. Better to face the truth, however painful, than to let it fester in darkness." Mrs. Coleman walked her to the gate, moving like someone decades older than her years. As Miss Marple turned toward the lane, George Coleman emerged from the barn, his expression thunderous. "Playing detective again, Miss Marple?" "Simply paying a social call." "Mr. Coleman." "Is that what they're calling it now?" He moved closer, his voice dropping. "My brother's dead. Nothing you discover will change that. Best to let sleeping dogs lie." An interesting choice of phrase. Miss Marple regarded him with placid interest. "Though in my experience, sleeping dogs often wake at inconvenient moments." She continued down the lane without waiting for his response. Behind her, George Coleman stood watching until she disappeared around the bend. That evening, Miss Marple encountered Wilfred Shaw at the village inn. She had timed her arrival precisely to coincide with his usual stop for a pint after market day. The publican, recognizing Mrs. Bantry's guest, showed her to a quiet corner where she could observe the room without being obtrusive. Shaw sat alone near the fire, nursing his drink with the contemplative air of a man reviewing an unsatisfactory day. Miss Marple approached with her knitting bag and an apologetic smile. "Mr. Shaw, forgive the intrusion, but I wonder if I might have a word. I'm Miss Marple, staying with Mrs. Bantry at Gossington Hall." Shaw rose with the automatic courtesy of his generation. "Of course, Miss Marple. Won't you sit down?" She settled into the chair opposite, arranging her knitting with practiced efficiency. "I understand you farm the land adjacent to Heatherbank. You must have known Mr. Coleman quite well." Shaw's weathered face grew guarded. "Well enough. We weren't friends, if that's what you're asking. Had our differences over the years." "Boundary disputes, I believe?" "Nothing serious. Disagreements about water rights to the stream, where the fence line should run, the usual quarrels between neighbors." He took a long drink. "Though I'll admit Arthur and I had words the week before he died. Harsh words, as it happens." "About the stream?" "About everything." Shaw set down his glass with force. "I told him he was a fool, running that farm into the ground with his pig-headed methods. Said George would have done better to stay in South Africa than waste his time trying to save a sinking ship." Miss Marple's needles moved with mechanical precision. "That must have angered him." "It did. He told me to mind my own affairs and keep my nose out of his family's business." Shaw's expression shifted, became troubled. "That was on the Thursday before he died. He died the following Tuesday night. The night you saw the light in the shed." Shaw's head snapped up. "How did you—" "Of course, village gossip. Nothing stays private in the country." "You told Inspector Slack you heard voices," Miss Marple said. "Could you distinguish who was speaking?" The farmer shifted in his seat. "I was across 2 fields, Miss Marple. Sound carries strangely at night, especially near water. But yes, I heard voices. 2 people, I think, though I can't be certain. One was definitely Arthur." I recognized his tone, that sharp way he had of speaking when agitated. The other was softer. Could have been his wife. Could have been the Harper girl. You couldn't tell which? No. Shaw leaned forward, his voice urgent. But here's what troubles me, Miss Marple. The voices weren't raised in anger. They were, I don't know how to describe it, desperate, maybe. Pleading. Like someone trying to convince another person not to do something foolish. Miss Marple's needles stilled. And then nothing. The light went out. I waited a few moments, decided it was none of my concern, and went to bed. He met her gaze directly. I've been wondering ever since if I should have gone over to check, if I might have prevented what happened. You think it wasn't an accident? Shaw drained his glass before answering. I think Arthur Coleman died that night, Miss Marple. Whether by accident or design, I couldn't say. But I don't believe he was alone in that shed. Someone else was there. Someone who walked away and said nothing. The fire crackled in the silence that followed. Outside, darkness had settled over the village like a shroud, and somewhere in that darkness, Heatherbank Farm held its secrets close. Chapter 5. Seeds in Winter. Dr. Haydock found Miss Marple in the Gossington Hall Library the next morning, surrounded by old copies of the local newspaper. Mrs. Bantry had unearthed them from the attic at Miss Marple's request, claiming they were needed for a village history project. Looking for something specific? The doctor settled into his usual chair, medical bag at his feet. Miss Marple looked up from a yellowed page dated October 1935. Actually, Dr. Haydock, you've arrived at precisely the right moment. I wonder if you might cast your professional eye over something. She passed him the newspaper, folded to an article about the inquest into Thomas Harper's presumed drowning. Haydock scanned the text, his expression growing increasingly thoughtful. The Harper boy. I remember this case. I wasn't the police surgeon then, Dr. Middleton held that position. But everyone in the district talked about it for months. He set down the paper. What's your interest in a 10-year-old tragedy? Patterns, Doctor. I find they often repeat themselves in instructive ways. Miss Marple removed her spectacles, polishing them with deliberate care. The boy's body was never recovered, which the coroner attributed to the marsh current. But you know the area. Is that plausible? Haydock considered. The stream does run swift in autumn, particularly after heavy rain. A body could be carried downstream, potentially into the river beyond. But, he paused, choosing his words. In my experience, drowning victims in shallow water tend to catch on vegetation or settle in pools. The marsh isn't that deep or fast-moving. I always thought it odd they found nothing. How interesting. Miss Marple replaced her spectacles. Now, regarding Arthur Coleman's death, you mentioned a head injury in addition to the chest wound. I did, though the chest wound was clearly the fatal injury. But if the head injury came first, if Mr. Coleman struck his head and fell against the pitchfork, rather than being struck by it, would the physical evidence differ? The doctor's face grew very still. What are you suggesting, Miss Marple? I'm not suggesting anything. Merely asking whether your initial examination considered that possibility. Haydock rose and paced to the window, staring out at the autumn garden. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of professional doubt. The angle of the chest wound was unusual. I noted it in my report, though Inspector Slack seemed disinclined to pursue the matter. If Coleman fell against the pitchfork, if his head injury rendered him unconscious first, the wound pattern would be consistent with what I observed. He turned back. The head injury alone might have been sufficient to cause death, given time and lack of medical attention. But the pitchfork wound was more dramatic and easier to classify as accidental. Precisely. Haydock returned to his chair, his professional composure cracking. Damn it, Miss Marple, if you're implying I missed something crucial, I'm implying nothing of the sort. You examined what you were shown and drew reasonable conclusions. Miss Marple's tone gentled. "But sometimes the scene we're presented with has been arranged for our benefit, like a stage set, carefully designed to guide our interpretation." The doctor absorbed this in silence. Mrs. Bantry appeared in the doorway, flushed with excitement. "Jane, you'll never guess what I've discovered. The newspaper archives mention that Thomas Harper had a sister, Ellen Harper, aged 15 at the time of his death. The family left the area shortly after the inquest, moved somewhere in Devon." Miss Marple and Dr. Haydock exchanged glances. "Ellen Harper," Miss Marple repeated softly. "Nell Harper. Rather a transparent alias, when one thinks about it." "Good Lord." Mrs. Bantry sank into a chair. "You mean the farmhand? She's the sister. She came back." "I believe so, though whether for justice or revenge remains to be determined." Miss Marple gathered the newspapers into a neat stack. "Dr. Haydock, would you be willing to accompany me to Heatherbank Farm this afternoon? I should like to speak with Miss Harper, and a medical man's presence might prove useful." "You think she killed Arthur Coleman?" "I think she knows what happened that night. Whether she participated or merely witnessed, well, that's what we must discover." They found Nell Harper in the dairy, her sleeves rolled back, arms deep in the butter churn. She looked up as they entered, her expression shifting from surprise to wariness in the space of a heartbeat. "Miss Marple, Dr. Haydock, has something happened to Mrs. Coleman?" "Mrs. Coleman is quite well." Miss Marple moved closer, observing the girl's work with apparent interest. "What beautiful butter! You have a gift for this work, Miss Harper. Or should I say, Miss Ellen Harper?" The rhythmic churning ceased. Nell's hands remained frozen on the handle, her knuckles white. "I don't know what you mean." "I think you do." Miss Marple's voice remained gentle, but firm. "Your brother Thomas drowned in the marsh 10 years ago, accused of theft by Arthur Coleman. You've been working at Heatherbank Farm for 2 years under a slightly altered name, sending money to a solicitor in Dorset, presumably for your mother's care. You came back to learn the truth about what happened to your brother." Nell released the churn handle, wiping her hands on her apron with mechanical precision. "Who told you?" "Nobody told me. I simply recognized the pattern." Miss Marple settled onto a stool near the butter barrel. "Your brother was innocent, wasn't he?" "Yes." The word emerged fierce and absolute. "Tom would never have stolen anything. He was gentle, honest, afraid of his own shadow half the time. But Arthur Coleman swore he'd seen Tom driving sheep toward the marsh at midnight, and everyone believed him, a landowner's word against a laborer's boy." Dr. Haydock spoke quietly. "So you returned to expose Coleman?" Nell's laugh was bitter as ash. "I returned to find proof, to force him to admit what he'd done. I spent 2 years watching him, searching through his papers when he was out in the fields, listening to his conversations with George. And I discovered that Arthur Coleman had been stealing livestock from neighboring farms for years. I found his records hidden in the barn office, poorly locked. He kept them separate from the house accounts, never thinking a farmhand would search there. He'd been buying animals cheaply, altering their marks, selling them on at profit through dealers in the next county. Tom saw something he shouldn't have seen, so Arthur framed him to protect himself." "Did you confront Mr. Coleman with this knowledge?" Miss Marple asked. "No." Nell moved to the window, staring toward the marsh. "I was going to. I had everything ready. Dates, names, evidence I'd gathered piece by piece. But then I came to know Mrs. Coleman. She was kind to me when kindness wasn't required. Taught me things her husband would never have bothered to explain. And I saw how frightened she was, how small he made her feel." Her voice dropped. "I couldn't decide what justice meant anymore. Exposing Arthur would destroy her, but letting him go unpunished felt like betraying Tom's memory." "So you waited," Miss Marple said. "I waited." Nell turned back to face them, her expression stripped bare. "And then someone else sent Arthur a letter. I don't know who or what it contained. but it terrified him. He stopped sleeping, stopped eating properly, started watching the marsh like he expected Tom's ghost to rise from the water. Mrs. Coleman grew more frightened each day, though she tried to hide it. The night Mr. Coleman died. Where were you? Nell met her gaze without flinching. In my cottage. I heard nothing until morning when I went to start the milking and found the shed door open. I saw Arthur lying there, the pitchfork beside him, blood on the floor. I knew immediately something was wrong. Wrong in what way? The lantern was burning inside the shed, when Arthur always kept it by the door. His boots were clean, despite the muddy ground, and the pitchfork was lying at an odd angle, as though it had been moved after he fell. Nell's hands clenched at her sides. I knew someone else had been there, someone who tried to make it look like an accident. And you said nothing to the police, Dr. Haydock observed. No, the admission came heavy with guilt, because I suspected who that someone was, and I couldn't bear to see her punished for finally standing up to him. Mrs. Coleman, Miss Marple said. Nell nodded. I have no proof, but I know fear when I see it, and Mrs. Coleman has been drowning in fear since the morning we found him. Not grief, fear, the kind that eats you from the inside like rust through iron. Miss Marple rose from her stool, brushing dust from her skirt. Thank you for your honesty, Miss Harper. I imagine the past 2 years have been exceedingly difficult. Every day I wake up wondering if I've betrayed my brother's memory by protecting his murderer's wife. Nell's voice cracked. Is that justice, Miss Marple, or just cowardice dressed up in compassion? Sometimes, Miss Marple said gently. The line between justice and mercy is thinner than we'd like to believe. Your brother's innocence will be known, Miss Harper. That much I can promise you. They left her standing in the dairy, surrounded by butter churns and milk pails, her face reflecting the weight of secrets carried too long. Outside, Dr. Haydock spoke first. So Mrs. Coleman killed her husband. I believe so, though not with intent to murder. We must speak with her again. Miss Marple paused on the path, her gaze drifting toward the marsh. But first, I think Inspector Slack should hear what we've learned. He won't like it, but he needs to understand the full picture before we proceed. The autumn sun hung low over Heatherbank Farm, casting long shadows across the fields. In the distance, the marsh gleamed dark as old blood, keeping its secrets beneath the surface where light could not reach. Somewhere in that darkness, Thomas Harper's story waited to be told. And somewhere in the farmhouse, Edith Coleman prepared to face the consequences of her desperate act. Chapter 6. The Truth at Heatherbank. Inspector Slack arrived at Heatherbank Farm with the expression of a man who had been dragged from his office against his better judgment. Miss Marple had telephoned him that morning with a request he could not ignore, though he had tried. This had better be important, Miss Marple. I have 3 cases pending in Lower Swinstead and the chief constable breathing down my neck. It is important, Inspector. I believe we are about to learn the truth of what happened the night Arthur Coleman died. Miss Marple stood in the drawing room, her knitting bag conspicuously absent. I've asked everyone to join us. Mrs. Coleman, Mr. George Coleman, Miss Harper, Dr. Haydock, and yourself. Mrs. Bantry has kindly agreed to act as witness to the proceedings. Slack's mustache bristled. This isn't a parlor game, Miss Marple. If you have evidence of wrongdoing, you should present it to me privately. I have no concrete evidence, Inspector. Only a pattern that I believe, when laid before the participants, will reveal the truth. She turned as footsteps sounded in the hall. Ah, here they are now. Mrs. Coleman entered first, supported by Nell Harper. The older woman's face was grey as old paper, her movements those of someone walking toward the gallows. George Coleman followed, his expression thunderous, while Dr. Haydock brought up the rear with his medical bag clutched like a talisman. They settled into chairs with the stiff formality of strangers at a funeral. Mrs. Bantry positioned herself near the door, her usual ebullience subdued by the weight of the occasion. Miss Marple remained standing, her hands folded before her. "Thank you all for coming. I know this is difficult, particularly for you, Mrs. Coleman, but I believe the time has come for truth, however painful it may prove." She paused, gathering her thoughts with the care of someone selecting which thread to pull. 10 years ago, a boy named Thomas Harper died, or was presumed to have died. In the marsh beyond these fields, he had been accused of livestock theft by Arthur Coleman and fled rather than face prosecution. His body was never recovered. George Coleman stirred. "Ancient history, Miss Marple. What has that to do with my brother's accident?" "Everything, Mr. Coleman, because Thomas Harper was innocent. Your brother framed him to conceal his own criminal enterprise, a systematic theft of livestock from neighboring farms, which Arthur then sold through irregular channels for profit." "That's a damned lie." George half rose from his chair. "Is it?" Miss Marple's gaze remained steady. "I think you suspected as much when you returned from South Africa. The farm's finances never matched the stock Arthur claimed to own. Bills paid that shouldn't have been possible given the farm's production. Small inconsistencies that troubled you but which you couldn't quite explain." George subsided, his jaw working. "Thomas Harper's sister, Ellen, returned to Heatherbank 2 years ago under the name Nell Harper. She came seeking proof of her brother's innocence and your brother's guilt." Miss Marple turned to Nell, who sat rigid beside Mrs. Coleman. "You found that proof, didn't you, Miss Harper?" Nell's voice emerged steady despite the tension in her shoulders. "Yes. Papers Arthur kept locked in his study, records of sales, payments to dealers, dates that matched when animals went missing from other farms. He'd been stealing for years." "But you didn't expose him," Miss Marple continued, "because by then you'd come to care for Mrs. Coleman, and you knew the revelation would destroy her along with Arthur's reputation. I couldn't decide what to do." Nell's hands twisted in her lap. "Every day I delayed felt like betraying Tom. But every day I also saw what Arthur's cruelty did to Mrs. Coleman, and I couldn't bring myself to make her life worse." Inspector Slack leaned forward. "This is all very enlightening, but it doesn't explain Coleman's death. Unless you're suggesting Miss Harper killed him." "No, Inspector. Miss Harper did not kill Arthur Coleman." Miss Marple moved to stand near the window, where the afternoon light cast her face in shadow. 6 weeks before his death, Arthur received a letter. We don't know who sent it, but its contents terrified him. He stopped sleeping, grew paranoid, watched the marsh as though expecting retribution from beyond the grave. "Mrs. Coleman, you told me your husband said he needed to settle something from long ago." Mrs. Coleman's voice barely rose above a whisper. "Yes. I believe that letter threatened to expose his crimes, perhaps from someone who had dealt with him years ago and now found their conscience troubling them." Arthur panicked. The weight of his guilt, carried silently for a decade, became unbearable. Miss Marple turned from the window. "On the night he died, you finally confronted him with what you'd learned, didn't you, Mrs. Coleman?" The room fell into absolute silence. Mrs. Coleman's hands gripped the arms of her chair, her breathing shallow and rapid. "I didn't mean, I never intended—" The words tumbled out like water breaching a dam. "I heard him crying that night, crying like a child, saying he was damned, that the boy's death was on his soul. I couldn't bear it any longer. I told him I knew what he'd done, that I'd found the papers in his study. I told him he had to confess, to make it right somehow." "And he refused," Miss Marple said gently. "He was furious. Said I had no right to meddle, that what was done and confession would destroy us both. Then he grabbed his coat and said he was leaving, that he'd disappear before anyone could force him to face consequences." Tears streamed down Mrs. Coleman's face. "I followed him to the shed. I begged him not to run, told him we'd find a way through it together, but he pushed past me, trying to reach the far door that leads to the fields." Dr. Haydock spoke quietly. "What happened then, Mrs. Coleman?" "I grabbed his arm to stop him. We struggled. He was stronger than me, but desperation made me hold on. He pulled away violently and slipped. The roof had been leaking that week, leaving puddles near the trough. He fell backward. His head struck the stone trough with a terrible sound. He collapsed near the pitchfork that was leaning against the wall. He was already dead or dying from the head injury, Dr. Haydock said. The pitchfork wound was likely inflicted when you repositioned it against him. Mrs. Coleman nodded, unable to speak. Inspector Slack's voice cut through the heavy silence. Why didn't you call for help? Report what happened. I panicked. The admission came broken and raw. I saw him lying there, blood spreading across the floor, and all I could think was that everyone would believe I'd murdered him. The bitter wife, who finally snapped. I positioned the pitchfork to make it look like he'd fallen directly onto it, moved it so the wound would seem accidental, placed the lantern where it would seem he'd been carrying it. Then I ran back to the house and pretended I'd slept through everything. Nell Harper spoke for the first time. I found them in the morning. I saw the staging immediately, the clean boots, the lantern's position. I knew Mrs. Coleman had been there, and I chose to say nothing. Why? Inspector Slack demanded. Because Arthur Coleman destroyed my brother's life to protect his own crimes. His death was justice, even if it came through accident rather than the law. Nell's voice hardened. Mrs. Coleman spent years trapped in fear because of what her husband was. She doesn't deserve to hang for finally trying to stop him from running away from his guilt. George Coleman rose abruptly, pacing to the fireplace. So my brother was a thief and a liar who let an innocent boy drown rather than face his own crimes, and his wife accidentally killed him while trying to stop him from fleeing justice. He turned back. What happens now, Inspector? Slack looked to Dr. Haydock, then to Miss Marple, then finally to Mrs. Coleman's ravaged face. His internal struggle played out in the deepening lines around his eyes. Dr. Haydock, in your professional opinion, could this have occurred as Mrs. Coleman describes? The doctor nodded slowly. Yes. The head injury was severe enough to have caused death. The chest wound, while dramatic, was likely inflicted as he fell unconscious. The physical evidence supports her account. And the staging of the scene? The actions of a frightened woman protecting herself, not a calculated murderer. Dr. Haydock's voice was firm. Arthur Coleman's death was the result of his own actions, running from guilt, fighting with his wife, slipping on wet ground. It was an accident, Inspector, just not the simple accident we initially presumed. Inspector Slack stood, moving to the window where he stared out at the marsh for a long moment. When he turned back, his face was set. Mrs. Coleman, you have committed serious offenses, tampering with evidence, misleading a police investigation. However, given the circumstances and Dr. Haydock's professional assessment, I am prepared to amend my report to reflect that Arthur Coleman's death occurred during a domestic altercation that resulted in an accidental fall. The coroner's verdict of misadventure will stand. Mrs. Coleman's sob of relief was painful to hear. But, Slack continued, his voice stern, the truth about Thomas Harper must be made public. That boy's name deserves to be cleared. I'll see to it, George Coleman said quietly. I'll make a statement about Arthur's crimes, compensate the families he stole from. It's the least I can do. He looked at Nell Harper. And you, Miss Harper, should stay on at Heatherbank if you're willing. God knows we need someone who actually knows how to run a farm properly. Miss Marple gathered her things, preparing to depart. Mrs. Coleman reached out, grasping her hand. How did you know? How did you see what everyone else missed? Because human nature remains constant, Mrs. Coleman. Fear and guilt leave patterns, like footprints in snow. One simply has to know where to look. Miss Marple squeezed her hand gently. Arthur's crimes planted seeds that waited years to grow. His own fear brought about his end. You were merely there when those seeds finally broke through the surface. As they departed, Miss Marple glanced back once at Heatherbank Farm. The milking shed stood silent in the fading light, no longer a place of secrets, but simply a shed. Empty, ordinary, stripped of its power to terrify. The truth, she reflected, had that effect, like sunlight burning away morning mist. Epilogue. The marsh in silence. 3 weeks had passed since that afternoon at Heatherbank Farm, when truth finally emerged from its hiding place. Miss Marple sat in the morning room at Gossington Hall, her knitting needles maintaining their familiar rhythm while Mrs. Bantry read aloud from the local newspaper. Inspector Slack has filed an amended report regarding the death of Arthur Coleman of Heatherbank Farm. While the coroner's verdict of death by misadventure stands, additional information has come to light regarding the circumstances surrounding Mr. Coleman's final evening. The deceased had been under considerable emotional strain prior to his death, related to matters of conscience regarding events from a decade past. Mrs. Bantry set down the paper. Very carefully worded. Inspector Slack can be diplomatic when circumstances require it, Miss Marple observed. The essential facts are preserved without unnecessary details that would serve no purpose except to cause pain. And the business about Thomas Harper? George Coleman made a full statement last week. The boy's name has been cleared of any wrongdoing and compensation has been paid to his mother in Dorset. Miss Marple's needles paused. The letter that so terrified Arthur was never traced to its sender, perhaps an old associate whose conscience finally troubled him, or someone who had discovered the crimes independently. It hardly matters now. What matters is that truth emerged. She resumed knitting. Nell Harper visited her mother last Saturday. Mrs. Bantry mentioned she seemed lighter somehow, as though a weight had been lifted. Will she stay at Heatherbank? I believe so. George Coleman has proven himself a capable farmer, and he values Nell's expertise. They've already begun improvements to the drainage system and have plans to rebuild the dairy. Miss Marple resumed her knitting. Mrs. Coleman has taken rooms in the village. She couldn't bear to remain at the farm after everything. But she visits the garden twice weekly to tend the roses we planted. Small steps toward healing. Mrs. Bantry rose and moved to the window, watching the autumn leaves scatter across the lawn. Do you think justice was served, Jane? Truly. Miss Marple considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. Arthur Coleman destroyed a young boy's life and reputation to conceal his own crimes. He lived 10 years with that guilt eating away at him, until his own fear and desperation brought about his end. His wife, driven to desperation by years of his cruelty, tried to stop him from running away from the consequences of his actions. The struggle that followed was an accident, a tragedy born from a decade of lies and fear. But she staged the scene afterward. She did, and that was wrong, but Inspector Slack weighed the circumstances, a frightened woman protecting herself versus a calculated murderer. He chose mercy, tempered with truth. Thomas Harper's innocence is now public record. Arthur Coleman's crimes are acknowledged. Mrs. Coleman must live with the knowledge of what happened, which is perhaps punishment enough. Miss Marple set down her knitting, meeting her friend's gaze. Is that justice? Perhaps not in the strictest legal sense, but I believe it serves the greater good. The front door opened and closed. Dr. Haydock appeared in the doorway, stamping mud from his boots. Afternoon, ladies. Just returned from Heatherbank. Nell Harper asked me to check on one of the ewes. Difficult lambing season ahead, apparently. He settled into his chair with a satisfied grunt. Place looks transformed already. George Coleman has real vision for the property, even hired 2 new farm hands from Lower Swinstead. And Mrs. Coleman? Miss Marple asked. Saw her in the garden when I arrived. She was pruning the roses, talking to them the way gardeners do. She looked, well, not happy exactly, but peaceful. The haunted look has faded. Haydock accepted tea from Mrs. Bantry. The milking shed remains locked. I noticed. Some places carry too many memories, Miss Marple said quietly. Better to let them rest. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the afternoon light fade toward evening. Somewhere beyond the windows, beyond the village and the fields, Heatherbank Farm settled into its new existence, a place no longer bound by secrets, but simply carrying on with the practical business of farming life. The marsh beyond the fields lay still and silent, its waters reflecting the gray October sky. No ghosts walked there now. Thomas Harper's story had been told, his innocence proclaimed. The burden of his memory no longer rested solely on his sister's shoulders, but had been shared, acknowledged, and finally laid to rest in the proper manner. Miss Marple picked up her knitting once more, the grey wool taking shape beneath her practiced fingers. "People think secrets are buried," she remarked, as though speaking to herself. "But they are not. They simply wait, like seeds in winter, until something comes along to make them grow." Mrs. Bantry glanced at her friend. "And when they do grow, then they must be dealt with, one way or another. Exposed to light, examined, understood." Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily. Some flowers that bloom from such seeds are beautiful in their truth. Others are bitter and painful, but all are necessary if the garden is to be healthy again. Dr. Haydock raised his teacup in a small salute. "To truth, then, however uncomfortable it may prove." "To truth," Miss Marple agreed, "and to mercy, which must sometimes walk hand in hand with justice if either is to serve any useful purpose." Outside, the wind picked up, rustling through the autumn leaves and carrying with it the scent of rain. Winter approached, bringing its cleansing cold, its promise of sleep and eventual renewal. At Heatherbank Farm, Nell Harper closed the dairy door and walked toward her cottage, her path no longer skirting the marsh, but passing directly beside it. She paused there briefly, looking down at the dark water, then continued on her way, without fear. The past had been acknowledged. The dead could rest, and the living could finally begin to heal. In the warm comfort of Gossington Hall, Miss Marple smiled to herself and returned her attention to her knitting, content in the knowledge that, for once, the pattern had emerged exactly as it should. The truth has surfaced at last, drawn up from fear, guilt, and years of quiet endurance. What was buried beneath habit and silence has been named, examined, and finally laid to rest. This story now returns to its place among the shelves of the hidden library, no longer hidden, but remembered. If this mystery stayed with you, leave a like, subscribe, and share your thoughts below. Your reflections keep these forgotten volumes alive. Until another book is taken down, remember, secrets are never truly buried. They wait patiently for the moment they are ready to be known.